Would you stay silent? A young man's choice that changed everything. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Reagan National Airport's bustling Terminal C, where Flight 1776 to Arlington was preparing for departure. Through the terminal's soaring windows, passengers could see the standard pre-flight bustle on the tarmac, luggage carts zipping between planes, ground crew directing traffic with orange wands, and the usual parade of aircraft taxiing to and from the runways. But something else caught the eye of a tall, well-dressed young man standing quietly at Gate 17. Unlike the other passengers crowded around charging stations or buried in their phones, his attention was fixed on an unusual sight. A black hearse approaching the aircraft, flanked by members of the Army Honor Guard in their crisp dress uniforms. Barron Trump shifted his weight, adjusting the strap of his leather messenger bag. The boarding process had already begun, with first-class passengers filing onto the plane. A harried-looking businessman in an expensive charcoal suit pushed past Barron, barely glancing up from his phone. "These delays are killing me," he muttered, to no one in particular, his platinum frequent flyer tag swinging from his briefcase. Sarah Chen, a young tech executive seated nearby, looked up from her laptop and nodded in agreement. "I know, right? My team's waiting on me for a major product launch. Every minute counts." Barron watched as the honor guard began their solemn ceremony on the tarmac. Their movements were precise, practiced, each step carrying the weight of tradition and respect. As they carefully unfolded the American flag to drape over the casket, a flight attendant's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for a slight delay in our boarding process. We are honored to be transporting a fallen soldier to their final resting place today. Please join us in showing respect during this ceremony." The announcement triggered a wave of reactions throughout the gate area. Some passengers fell silent, while others grew more agitated. The businessman, whose name tag identified him as Richard Palmer, made a show of checking his watch and sighing dramatically. "This is ridiculous," Palmer announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Do they realize some of us have actual obligations, important meetings? They could schedule these transfers around peak business hours." Sarah Chen closed her laptop with a sharp snap. "Seriously, I mean, it's sad and all, but this is a commercial flight, not a military transport." Their words seemed to embolden others. A woman juggling a designer handbag and two restless children chimed in. "My kids are already tired. Now we have to wait even longer?" Alex chuckled. Catching up to the train multiple cars ahead of them, Mason said. Barron felt his jaw tighten. Near the window, an elderly man in a Vietnam veteran's cap stood watching the ceremony, his weathered face a mask of barely contained emotion. A young Marine in his dress blues, clearly heading back to base, stared straight ahead, his posture rigid. The disgruntled comments continued to ripple through the crowd. Palmer had gathered a small audience of like-minded passengers, his complaints growing louder with each passing minute. "This is exactly what's wrong with the country today. Everything's become a ceremony, a performance. Time is money, people." That's when Barron noticed something that made his heart sink further. Through the window, he could see a small group of people standing apart from the honor guard. A family. A woman in a black dress held the hand of a young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old. Even from this distance, their grief was palpable, deteriorated so drastically. He thought about staying quiet. It would have been easier, certainly safer from a public relations standpoint. His security detail, discreet but present, had been trained to keep him out of exactly these kinds of situations. But as he watched that little girl clutching her mother's hand, watching her father's casket being loaded onto the plane, something shifted inside him. Barron took a deep breath and stepped forward, his movement drawing attention simply because of his height and presence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he spoke, his words carried across the gate area with quiet authority. "Excuse me," he began, his eyes meeting Palmer's. "I couldn't help but overhear your concerns about the delay." What? The businessman turned, irritation clear on his face, but his expression flickered with recognition as he realized who was addressing him. The gate area grew quieter, passengers looking up from their phones and tablets. "Slow down, that casket you're so inconvenienced by," Barron continued, his voice steady but intense. "It holds someone who wrote a blank check to this country for an amount up to and including their life. And they just cashed it." He gestured toward the window, where the family stood watching the ceremony. "That little girl out there, she's not going to see her father again. Ever. But please, tell us more about your important meeting." The silence that followed was absolute. Palmer's face had drained of color, his earlier bravado evaporating under the weight of Barron's words and the collective stares of other passengers. Sarah Chen had closed her laptop, her earlier complaints forgotten as she watched the scene unfold. Barron wasn't finished. He reached into his messenger bag and pulled out something that made several people gasp softly. A carefully folded American flag, similar to the one now draped over the casket below. "This flag was given to my father by a Gold Star family," he explained, his voice softening but losing none of its intensity. "They wanted him to remember what their sacrifice meant. Today I think we all need that reminder." A hush fell over the gate area as Barron carefully unfolded the flag he'd carried. The crisp red and white stripes caught the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the terminal windows. "My father taught me something important about these flags," Barron continued, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "Each fold has meaning, honor, truth, justice. But most importantly, they represent promises kept, even at the ultimate cost." Sarah Chen had moved closer, her laptop forgotten on the nearby seat. The young tech executive's earlier irritation had been replaced by something else. Recognition, perhaps, of how her own words must have sounded to the grieving family outside. In spite of herself, she drew softly closer to the front of the building before exiting his own office. Sarah laid her head against the desk. The boarding process resumed, but something had changed in the atmosphere. Passengers moved with deliberate care, their earlier rush forgotten. As they filed onto the plane, many paused at the windows, watching the honor guard complete their ceremony with precision that spoke of countless similar moments, each as important as the last. This was his world. The world he had created for himself and his 17-year-old brother. Inside the aircraft, Barron made his way to his seat in the back, preferring to stay out of the spotlight. But the impact of his words continued to ripple through the cabin. The Vietnam veteran, who had watched the scene at the gate, stopped beside Barron's row. "Son," the older man said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "My name's Frank Martinez. I carried men like him home in '69. Back then, well, let's just say we didn't always get this kind of respect." He extended his hand, which Barron shook firmly. "Different times, sir," Barron replied, "but the sacrifice stays the same." Martinez nodded, eyes glistening. "Would you mind if I—" He gestured to the empty seat next to Barron. "Lieutenant, please." As other passengers settled in, snippets of quiet conversation filtered through the cabin. Richard Palmer, now subdued, sat stiffly in his first-class seat, his phone untouched in his pocket. Through his window he could see the honor guard's final movements, their precision a silent rebuke to his earlier complaint. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, different from the usual pre-flight announcements. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we have the solemn privilege of carrying one of our nation's fallen heroes, Army Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, returning home to his final resting place. We'll observe a moment of silence during our takeoff roll. We hope this prayer will be understood by all who witness it." Sarah Chen, who had ended up seated across the aisle from Barron and Martinez, noticed a woman a few rows ahead crying softly. Without hesitation, she pulled a pack of tissues from her bag and passed them forward, each passenger silently relaying them until they reached their destination. As the plane began to taxi, Martinez turned to Barron. You know, when I came home, we were told to fly in civilian clothes. People didn't want to see the uniform, didn't want the reminder. He paused, looking out at the honor guard standing at attention. Staff Sergeant Torres, he's coming home the way we all should have. The takeoff roll was indeed silent, save for the sound of the engines. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. As the plane lifted into the evening sky, the setting sun painted the clouds in shades of red and gold, a fitting tribute to the precious cargo in their midst. Passenger compartments were filled with every person in the world, mass silent. Halfway through the flight, Richard Palmer unbuckled his seatbelt and made his way to the back of the plane. His face had lost its earlier arrogance, replaced by something approaching humility. He stopped at Barron's row. "I need to apologize," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My son, he's serving in the 10th Mountain Division. Every day I worry, and today, instead of remembering what that means, I acted like—" "Take a seat, Mr. Palmer," Martinez offered, standing to let the businessman sit beside Barron. "Tell us about your son." What followed was a conversation that transformed the entire cabin. Palmer spoke of his son's dedication, his own fears masked by business meetings and deadlines. Sarah Chen shared that her grandfather had served in the Korean War, stories she'd been too busy to really hear until now. Other passengers joined in, sharing connections to service and sacrifice that had been buried under the rush of daily life. As the plane began its descent into Arlington, the pilot's voice returned. "We're about to land with our precious cargo. Staff Sergeant Torres's family asked me to share something with you." His daughter Sophie, who some of you might have seen at the airport, wanted everyone to know that her daddy was a hero who loved to tell her bedtime stories. She hopes that wherever you're going tonight, you'll take a moment to tell someone you love them. Daughter Sophie? The cabin crew had to remind passengers to stay seated after landing, not because they were rushing to leave, but because so many had remained in their conversations, bound together by a thread of understanding that hadn't existed 2 hours earlier. As they finally deplaned, Richard Palmer handed Barron a business card. "My company works with veteran entrepreneurs," he said. Maybe we can do more." Sarah Chen had already pulled up her company's veteran hiring initiative on her laptop. "We're always looking for leadership experience," she said, sharing the information with Martinez. Outside, the same honor guard waited in the fading light. Passengers lined the terminal windows, many rendering salutes alongside Martinez. Barron stood quietly with them, the flag still in his hands. Staff Sergeant Torres was home, and somehow he had helped all of them find their way home to what mattered too. That evening, countless phones lit up with messages to loved ones. Richard Palmer called his son. Sarah Chen called her grandfather. And somewhere in that Virginia twilight, a little girl named Sophie held her mother's hand, knowing that her father's last journey had touched hearts in ways that would ripple outward long after this day. Sometimes the greatest acts of leadership don't come from boardrooms or podiums, but from quiet moments when someone stands up to remind us all of what truly matters. In an age of constant rush and endless deadlines, it takes courage to pause and honor sacrifice. But as one young man proved on an ordinary flight that became extraordinary, those moments of pause might just be the most important moments of all.